Namaste. Welcome, friends. Today's talk is on trust, trusting who we are, trusting our basic goodness, trusting and seeing the sacredness that lives through all of life. And as many know, it's a theme I return to often. I chose this one from the archives because so much of our core suffering circles around distrust and our hope for the future uh, circles around what I call trusting the gold. And sometimes I imagine how our world would be if we could move through life, seeing the imperfections and also the aliveness, the love, and the consciousness that animates our living world. Maybe you can see it, that goodness in the innocence of babies, baby humans and baby lambs and baby puppies, calves. Maybe you see it in trees and flowers. It's possible, and we can start simply. You might just choose one person, whoever seems easiest, and each day for a number of days, intentionally reflect on their goodness. Get familiar with seeing the light that's our source, and you'll naturally find that it expands to include more and more of the world. And as that happens, your joy will expand. Okay, friends, may this serve you well. So again, namaste. And, I'm imagining many of you are familiar with the word. Namaste means that the light in me bows to the sacred light in you. And I really love it. When I do this, when I say namaste and I feel it, like I get embodied, what happens is in some way I get more real, more sincere, and then I feel us all in the field together, which really matters. I often think about, in the West, we greet each other with a handshake, I don't have a gun, and then the East, I see the divine in you. So different flavors. And I'm spending a few moments with Namaste because I really would like to dedicate this opening talk to the spirit of Namaste, of what it really means to see and trust the goodness that lives through all of us. That basic goodness of awareness, light, love, open-heartedness. It's the awareness that connects us to each other. And what we'll do is we'll look at what makes this perception and experience of really seeing the sacred in each other so incredibly relevant to these times, to our clinical work. And really, we'll look at how that trust in goodness can be cultivated. So I start with Einstein because he had this inquiry that framed this so well. He said, I think the most important inquiry facing, actually, he put a question. I think the most important question facing humanity is the universe a friendly place? He said, this is the first and most basic question all people must answer for themselves. Is the universe a friendly place? And Einstein believed that there is a fundamental benevolence in us, in our living world. And he claimed that if you can perceive and trust this goodness, it gives rise to activity that serves the collective, serves our understanding, allows for peace, cooperation, well-being. And he also contrasted and he said, mistrusting, not sensing basic goodness leads to armoring, defense, aggression. Okay, so in Buddhist psychology and in many traditions, trusting basic goodness is kind of a code that says basically trusting our essential nature as formless, loving awareness, that's what we trust in. And the path is kind of framed as this unfolding from a contracted identification as a separate self, where we get all caught in grasping and aggressing and defending. So starting there in that contracted identification, to really inhabiting the awake field of awareness, sensing we're the ocean and we include all the waves, realizing our belonging. There are a good number of evolutionary psychologists, I know you are aware of this, that describe our trajectory, really our accomplishment as a species in terms of trusting each other, widening our capacity for collaboration beyond kin, the capacity to identify with widening circles that leads to more pro-social behavior, including all the expressions that we cherish of compassion, empathy, love. And research shows that this shift to connectedness is rewarded. It's rewarded with these feel-good chemicals that are released in the brain, that feeling compassion feels good, that feeling connectedness quiets our fears, that we love love. Okay, so this is our potential to move, to make that shift from self-other or from us-them to we, to that trust in basic goodness, to trust in that shared field of loving awareness. And the reality is, if we look at our own lives and we look at people we know, and we look at our species, of course, it's gradual, fits and starts, many rounds of forgetting this larger truth. One description I really like of daily life is, it's called the big squeeze, whereby we all have this deep intuiting of our true nature, of our capacity for wakeful presence and for loving without holding back, real inclusive love. We have an intuition of that. And every day, I'll speak for myself now, getting caught in this kind of self-centered trance, moving around in this bubble of self on the way somewhere else, fixating on furthering the self, controlling things, getting more comfortable, getting approval, feeling good about ourselves. And then, of course, when we get hijacked, really feel threatened, really feel separate, we can be reactive in quite a full way where we really lose touch with our frontal cortex, with, executive reasoning and with mindfulness and compassion. There's a woman in a little story I read, she's in a job interview, and the interviewer says, tell me, what do you think your biggest character defect is? And her response is honesty. And he goes, honesty? I wouldn't consider honesty a defect. Her reply, I don't care what the hell you think. Partly I have to entertain myself during these because it's fun. And we know we get caught in a small reactive self and say things we regret as we start relaxing open and living from a larger sense of being. And of course, that hijacking happens in the wider society all the time. Groups threaten each other. And sadly, often the divides aren't even between hugely different groups. It's, we get threatened when others don't agree with our view, and it quickly turns into us, them. Another story I like, a Taoist master was sitting naked in his mountain cabin meditating, and a group of Confucianists entered the door of his hut. They had hiked up the mountain. They're intending to lecture him on the rules of proper conduct. And when they saw the sage just kind of sitting naked before them, they're totally shocked. And they say, well, what are you doing sitting in your hut without any pants on? And the sage replied, this entire universe is my hut. This little hut is my pants. What are you fellows doing in my pants? Okay, so the point is we have strong conditioning towards self-other, towards us, them. And of course, this mistrust leads to great violence. And through history, it increases dramatically in times of stress. So we know famines, pandemics, extreme weather, shrinking resources, it triggers the survival brain's mistrust, and humans regress. Bad othering takes over. So people stop cooperating, they turn against each other, they find witches, they blame those of difference, the non-dominant groups, and there's this violent competition for scarce resources, which brings us to really directly to what's happening in our current world. It's just hard to underestimate how the existential plight of the climate crisis and pandemics, and now the kind of warring, how many of us thought that we had evolved past this. Ukraine, it's just, horrified and broken hearts. And of course, it's not so highlighted in the Western media, which is so Euro, North American centric. The wars elsewhere. I think of Myanmar, almost 1 million Rohingya refugees in the last couple of years, living in horrific conditions. I think of Ethiopia, Libya, South Sudan. There's just so many places, incredible hardship. And it's alarming to see people within nations so divided. It's hard to talk about the divisions. We know it. I'm thinking of America's red, blue, just living in such siloed realities, that are driven by social media and radio news. Just the contempt and the hatred, this epidemic of bad othering, an enemy out there, and then devaluing life of the other. And then the movement towards strong men leaders and authoritarianism. Democracies require trust, and we're at low ebb. So I'm saying this all because our current times, our survival brain's hyperactive, and we have this deep undercurrent of unprocessed fear and mistrust. And here's the thing, we know when there's fear and mistrust of others, badness out there, it often goes hand in hand with being divided against and at war with ourselves. And I've seen in these last years, we've known how much, the deep suffering of self-hatred, but I feel like it's increasing. I read a story that was shared by the wonderful writer Annie Lamott. And in the story, there's this little girl, and she's asked what her father, who's a minister, does. And this is her response. She says, every Sunday, he stands in front of everyone and tells them that they are beautiful and God loves them exactly the way they are. And they really don't have to worry because they all have each other. But then by Tuesday, they forget this. So on Sunday, he goes back to church and tells them that they are beautiful and God loves them just as they are. And they don't have to worry because they all have each other. We forget, I call this the trance of unworthiness and written a lot about it in Radical Acceptance. It's so pervasive in our society with its undercurrent of individualism and competition and our values based on our externals. So there's no natural ways of just unconditional belonging. We have to jump through hoops. And of course, for non-dominant populations who are just devalued from the get-go, it's huge. And all of it together just fuels a lot of self-judgment, self-doubt, self-aversion, fundamentally flawed. I remember when I was talking about this on a book tour, I went to a Buddhist university, Naropa, and there was a workshop on the theme that I was teaching on, and the poster had this huge picture of me, and the line at the bottom said, "Something is wrong with me." I'll never forget walking into this hall and seeing that, something is wrong with me, and yet that's what it is. We go around with that often. And some of you might be thinking, well, yeah, but a lot of people go around feeling superior and special, and that's true. There's a lot of inflation and righteousness, but under it's a hollowness. There's a fragility because there's no essential sense of goodness. Because if we feel basic goodness, we don't put others up or down. We don't put ourselves up or down, because either way, it cuts us off. Really, the essence of basic goodness is a sense of intrinsic value of our beingness, of the awareness, that sentience that's taking in life right now, that aliveness, that light, that love, the wonder, the reverence. And it all arises from this basic sense of belonging to a larger whole. I love the way Thomas Merton puts it. He says, life is this simple. We are living in a world that is absolutely transparent, and the divine is shining through it all the time. This is not just a nice story or fable. It is true. Okay, so a personal sharing. I remember one time giving a talk about trusting basic goodness. I was talking about how meditation helps us contact and trust our basic goodness, which is what we'll be exploring more in a granular way soon. And this talk was during the years when my mom lived with me, and she'd accompany me and drive in and out to class. And so on the drives home, we'd usually discuss whatever I had talked about. So I'd given this talk about basic goodness and talked about Einstein's question and all that. And she was a Barnard philosophy major, and she really enjoyed challenging me. It was just fun. And she just came out with where's the basic goodness in racism and capital punishment and humans destroying the earth? And she went on and on a bit. And then she said, what makes goodness more basic than badness? So it's such a good question. I mean, maybe when I brought up Einstein, you wondered the same thing. We tussled a bit. And naturally, I agreed. There's no conceptual proof. And then I just shared subjectively that in my life, increasingly with awareness practices, heart practices, with prayer, there's been more and more of this direct experience behind the personality, behind the conditioning of something timeless, something formless, a loving awareness that's just shining through. And then I shared also something I hadn't named before. And it was really helpful for me to name it, which is that even when I feel disconnected, when I'm really caught in my ego and really not sensing goodness, I have a longing to feel and trust goodness. The longing's there. And that longing, that aspiration comes from goodness. That's the experience. It kind of calls me home. It has me look towards that formless presence, towards that basic innocence or purity or sincerity. And it helps me to look for it in others. It carries me back home. I want to pause here and just maybe ask you to check in. Just take a moment to feel your breath and feel your body. Know you're pausing. And I wonder, as you check in, do you feel you have a longing to trust your goodness? And do you sense that in your clients and in others? And as you're kind of reflecting, you might bring to mind Einstein's question and just sense, even with all the ignorance and cruelty and violence and reactivity of our world, do you trust there's a fundamental benevolence or love or goodness in life, something essential like that? Do you trust that lives through you and others? And maybe as I continue, you can just sense for yourself what helps you remember. What have you noticed helps others? Because this is what I want to explore right now. Really, this shift from I to we to that belonging that deepens our trust in goodness. And there's a story with an image that helps me a lot in remembering for myself and in teaching and so on. Some of you are familiar with the story of there's a existing now a solid gold, huge Buddha statue in Thailand, and it's For centuries, though, it was covered with plaster and clay. It was just discovered in the 1950s after a real storm that when cracks appeared in the coverings, they discovered that it was solid gold. But the monks believe, and historians confirm, that it was covered over to protect it during a violent invasion. In other words, it was covered over to get it through difficult times, just in the way we cover over our innate purity. We cover it over with our defenses and our aggressions and our strategies. And the suffering comes because we think we're the coverings. We get identified with our addictions and our successes and our failures and our defenses and so on. And we forget the gold. We forget that formless light that shines through. So one of the ways I think of it is that training in awareness, training in mindful awareness and compassion, what it does is our identification with those coverings loosens. Well, you're going to get, I'm not just those coverings. The coverings become more porous. And the light, the awareness, the sentience, the love is able to shine through more. So we start inhabiting a larger sense of being. And in time, we realize that this is more the truth of who we are than any story that we've told ourselves about ourselves. So the remainder of what I'd like to do is just talk about what facilitates that. And the first, it's really two main domains. And the first is really the trainings in bringing mindful self-compassion to what's arising in the moment. And this is part of that, attending to the shift in identity that happens, because that's often missed. Often we bring mindful self-compassion to things and we feel better and we move on, but we actually don't attend to, oh, who am I really? That's the first domain. And the second is to intentionally train ourselves to look towards the good. So for the first one, start where you are really. It's where we bring compassion and awareness to whatever suffering's expressing. And what I'll do is I'll ground it in an example of how we can kind of wake up through that into trusting more. And in this example, I'm going to use the acronym RAIN. Many of you are familiar, I know. It's a way of applying mindfulness and compassion to emotional suffering. It just got some easy steps to remember. And people find it valuable, especially when they've been hijacked, and really can't remember their way home. And what RAIN stands for is recognize and allow, and then investigate and intimate attention and nurture, which is the compassion. Then there's after the RAIN, which are the moments of non-doing presence where we start noticing, oh, a shift. What am I really? Okay, so in this example, this is when I was working with a man, an executive who really struggled with anger with his family and employees, and it really captured his identity. He was a bad, angry person. He judged himself a whole lot for being out of control. And when we practice RAIN, he had in mind a situation that brought up anger, and he recognized the anger, R. He allowed it, he let it be there for the moment. He investigated, and by the way, investigation is primarily somatic, but you can start, and it's helpful with what are you believing? And his belief was that in the moment of anger, that somebody's being an obstacle to my success, they're not cooperating, and even deeper, I'm going to fail, okay? I'm going to fail. That was under the anger, that fear, and a feeling of humiliation. And with it, the physicality was that he investigated explosive feeling in his chest that was driving him to action. The key question in investigating, what's needed here? What does this place need? What does this part of you need? And what it needed was to trust he'd be okay, trust he was good enough, that it would work out. And he had a grandfather who believed in him. And so he imagined his grandfather's hand on his shoulders, and that's how he self-nurtured, bringing that to mind. So he practiced this with his anger when he wasn't in the situation, but he also practiced when he was in the situation, a kind of light form of this, where he would just name it, anger, anger. He'd let it be there, he'd feel it, and he'd say, it's okay, you're good, this will work out. Okay, so he came to report in at a meditation class I was teaching for a very long time live in DC. And he told me that he was able to interrupt the acting out 1 out of 4 times, which was good. And he said he wanted to share one of those times. And this was when he was in a meeting with a project manager. And the manager admitted that the team had gotten behind schedule on a major project and that he personally had let some things fall through the cracks. So this man was feeling this rising irritation because, of course, in some way it would look bad for him and he'd feel like he was failing. And so he paused and inwardly, he's anger, anger, allow it, investigate, feel it, breathe, it's okay. And he didn't blow up. Instead, he just kept listening and taking the man in, long-term employee, kind of a dedicated guy, honest, thoughtful. Not only did he not pounce, but in this time, he expressed appreciation. He said, I'm sure you're trying the best you can. And the manager was caught off guard. And he said, I didn't plan to say this, but my wife has stage 4 cancer and I have 2 teens and it's a really rough time. And they hugged. It was the first time at work this had ever happened to him, something like this. And then he told me, and this is when he was telling me this after class with tears, he said, a month earlier, I would have unwittingly added to this man's burden by getting angry. And there we were hugging. And it was one of my saddest and best moments. It was like I'd found my way home to being a real human being. When he told me that, I had him practice. I didn't say you're doing this, but I had him practice after the rain. I said, well, remind yourself right this moment what that feels like to be a real human being. Just the quality of presence that you feel. What's your heart like? And I had him kind of go into that. And I said, who are you when you're feeling that? Just sense who you really are. Get familiar. This is what we long for, to really feel at home in ourselves, to trust our goodness. And in those moments of homecoming, when we're guiding clients or ourselves, don't just move on, get familiar when it arises. We'll just pause here. And what I thought we'd do is just practice a light rain, just to give you a taste. The practices we'll do will all be just brief practices. But take a moment wherever you are. And I love it that we're all around the globe, to feel how your posture is right now, to take a few full breaths. To invite yourself right here. And perhaps to bring to mind a situation where recently you went into self-judgment, where it was unpleasant, you felt some remorse or regret or upset at yourself, but not something that was traumatizing. It might have been something you said to somebody that felt wrong, or something you didn't say, some behavior. And just recognize by naming it, mentally whisper what you are noticing, whatever emotion comes up, anxiety, anger, fear. And the allow is really just to let it be. It's a sense that, okay, this is the waves in the ocean right now, just let it be. And with investigate, you might just sense what you're believing in these moments, however you acted, what it means to you. what might happen bad, being rejected, that it confirms in some way being bad. And with whatever you're believing, feel it in your body. And you might even let your posture and your face express what you're feeling when you're caught in that small self who's judging themselves feeling. Just sense it. Feel in your body what it's like when you're judging yourself. The contraction. And as you do, you might just ask yourself, well, what do I need right now? What do I need to remember or feel or trust? Maybe it's just keep learning and growing through all of this, or that you're doing the best you can right now. Or maybe it's to trust your basic goodness, that there's room for imperfection. But just sense a reminder. Let yourself feel it, like offer that reminder to yourself, nurture. Maybe put your hand on your heart. And just as sincerely as possible, offer some care. Noticing what shifts. Just noticing the difference between who you are now, holding with presence, with kindness, versus being in the story of a flawed self. And just trust that this presence, a little more spaciousness, this beingness, is more the truth of who you are. Let yourself get to know that. And so this is something you can share with clients, work with yourself on, of really bringing the mindfulness and compassion inward and then sensing, who am I really? So that's the first path of cultivating trust. The second is to intentionally look to see the good. And we start with the inner. That's traditionally, it's really effective to start with practicing with the inner, although you can really practice in any sequence and there's different people respond in different ways. But we do know is that with ourself and with others, the survival brain's negativity bias inclines us to notice the bad coverings, to mistrust bad self, bad other, and to cut off from the gold. So it becomes a really powerful part of the path, the healing and spiritual path, to intentionally look toward what we may be missing. So in Buddhist psychology, the meditation that we often do is called metta, or loving kindness. Again, I know many of you are familiar. It has 2 steps. And the first step is intentionally reflecting on goodness. And the second step is actively offering care. And so when you're guiding yourself or guiding a client, a way to intentionally attune to goodness is through inquiry, asking questions that help people to remember their intrinsic qualities of goodness. And examples that I would share with you are to ask, well, what's your deepest heart's intention or longing? You know, if you were at the end of your life looking back, what would matter? Because when you ask that question, you can sense in yourself, well, what would matter is being real or being loving, our presence, or helping relieve suffering. So you ask that question and then invite yourself or that person just to feel the goodness of that there's some basic goodness there. And you can intuit that it is really basic. A similar kind of inquiry, you know, what do you love? Bring to mind someone you love or some part of the natural world you love. What are you grateful for? What brings wonder or awe? You know, what makes you tender or compassionate? Because again, you're pointing them towards those being qualities, those essence expressions of awareness, and then allowing them to sense the goodness of that. For some, it really helps to just look through someone else's eyes, a person we trust or love. It could be a parent or friend or child or dog or spiritual figure. What do they see? What's the essence they see? Was working with one woman, very, very deep self-aversion, and loved journaling. So I had her write in her journal. She would write her fears and her pain and her self-doubts to the Divine Mother. She would just write a letter, this is all that's wrong with me. And then she'd write again from the Divine Mother to her, the truth of what's seen. Very powerful. So that's the first part of the loving kindness practice. Get in touch with the goodness. And the second part is to actively offer care. And that can be done through a verbal message, through touch, through imagery. I mean, how if you say, I love you out loud to someone, it actually brings alive the loving, right? Well, it's the same thing inwardly. And I find it's really helpful even to whisper out loud, caring messages, because it softens the armoring around the heart and it reconnects to loving presence. For me, it really helps to have the hand on the heart. And what I found is with myself and students and clients, even mechanical gestures of kindness work because under them is the truth that there's caring and it helps bring it forward. My book, Trusting the Gold, has a lot of the kind of teachings and flavors that I'm sharing right now. I would say for me these days, the gesture of loving kindness, the message that most cuts through is when I do say to myself, trust the gold, trust the goodness that's here. Even in this moment, as I say it, it cuts through any idea of a self that's performing, that's inflatedly wonderful or deflatedly terrible, back to sincerity and goodness. And because the inner and the outer dissolve in moments of feeling basic goodness, there's a sense, a unitive sense. Okay, let's pause again. I want to just have you try on a brief self practice that you can use to guide your clients that has to do with seeing and trusting. It's what Thomas Merton calls our secret beauty, our basic goodness. And again, pausing by coming into stillness if you're not already, and just give yourself the gift of letting go for a few moments. Just notice if there's any part of your body that wants to let go a little. You might feel a slight smile at the mouth. Let your breathing help to collect and relax you. And feel the breath at the heart. If it helps you connect with your heart, you might put your hand on your heart. And bring to mind someone you love, maybe someone who's easy to love. And take some moments to remind yourself of what you love about them, how their basic goodness shines through their particular body and mind, maybe in their humor, their brightness, their kindness, their sensitivity. And as you feel that appreciation, you might whisper, I love you, and say their name. And then again, letting the realness of the love be embodied, conveyed. And now, in a way, make a U-turn and just feel the goodness of your own loving. Feel the goodness of it. How it comes from something beyond a personal self, something very formless, boundless, Just offer yourself a wish right now, whatever wish resonates in this moment. And again, if it helps to feel that kind of a tender touch of the hand at the heart, that gesture of kindness, include that. And again, just to notice the sense of your own being right now when you're more in touch with goodness, what it's like, this presence that's here. If it feels enlarged or more tender, if you feel more at home. And take a few full breaths and know that the more you touch and attend to the goodness that's here, the more rooted you are in trust and the more easy it is to see others. You know, when we're caught inside our own spacesuit and identify with our own coverings, that's what we see in others. And to the degree that we're stressed, that we're reactive, that we're forgetting our own heart and spirit, all we see is ego around us. The gold is obscured. It's most difficult to see the gold when the person has harmed you or others, is threatening, person of real difference, you know, because of our incredibly strong conditioned societal bias, we get really blinded and contracted by racial difference, religious, class, quickly go into inferior, superior. We don't see the gold. One story that has lived with me for years now, a woman was, it was told by a Unitarian minister at a church I was attending with my family. And she describes traveling with her husband, two children on Christmas Day, and it had been a long, grueling trip. And they finally stopped for lunch at an empty diner. And as they're waiting for the meal, her 1-year-old begins waving from the high chair and calling, "Hi there," to someone that's sitting across the restaurant. And to the mom's dismay, it turns out to be a wreck of a man who's dressed in tattered, dirty clothes, unkempt, unwashed, obviously homeless drunk in her mind. And he's waving back at the boy and calling, "Hi there, baby. Hi there, big boy. I see you, Buster." And so she and her husband are exchanging looks. And, you know, a few other patrons in the restaurant are raising their eyebrows, shooting glances at each other. Nobody was amused by what was going on. But as the meal continued, the disturbance continued. And now the old guy was shouting across the room, "Hey, you know patty cake? Attaboy, you know peekaboo? And hey, look, he knows peekaboo," you know. And so the woman and her husband were cringing with embarrassment. And even their 6-year-old couldn't understand why this old man was talking so loud. So she tried to turn the 1-year-old's high chair around, but he screamed and twisted to face his new buddy. And not even waiting to finish their meal, her husband got up to pay the bill and took their older son to the car. The woman lifted her baby in her arms and she prayed to herself that she could pass by the old drunk without any commotion, without him touching her or anything. Clearly, it wasn't meant to be, because as she approached him, her young son reached out to his new friend with both arms, this in this pick me up signal, and she could see the old man's eyes asking, "Please, would you let me hold your baby?" And there wasn't time for an answer because the boy propelled himself into the old man's arms, and for a few long moments there was a communion, an old man and a young boy in a love relationship. And she could see the tears beneath the man's lashes as her son lay his head on his shoulder, and he gently rocked and cradled the boy. And then he looked her straight in the eyes and he said, "You take care of this baby." And when he reluctantly handed the baby back, it was as if he was tearing away his own heart. His final words to her were, "God bless you, ma'am. You've given me my Christmas gift." So she mumbled something in return and rushed out to the car. So tears are flowing. And her only thought was, my God, forgive me." I just remember after the minister shared this story, the congregation was absolutely still, and most of us were in tears. And I was just so aware of the countless times I'd failed to look and see the goodness of who's behind the mask, the coverings. So, friends, it takes intention. We're deeply conditioned by societal bias to not see. It takes intention to pause and say, who's here? What's this person's deep aspiration? To imagine them when they're happy or loved or really caring. And it won't be covering over with rose-colored lenses. It'll be truth. You're looking for the gold that shines through. So we train our attention to see, and we train ourselves to let others know, to be a mirror of the goodness, which I think that's our greatest healing superpower. When we remind each other of the gold. And our Namaste helps us do that. I had one of my first supervisors, and I asked him how he ended up being so non-judgmental and so inspiring to people. And he said, that he practiced Buber's thou. He would see somebody, he'd see their patterning and so on, but some part of him was going thou, thou, like Namaste. Arne Garborg says to love is to learn the song in their heart and sing it to them when they have forgotten. We need to remind each other. Okay, a final little reflection for you is, if you will, to continue to feel and attend inwardly for a few moments, and to bring to mind a dear one or a client or someone you see regularly. And use these moments to deepen attention. Maybe you can try on thou. What happens when you say thou? Or when you bow with Namaste. Just sensing what this being most deeply cares about, their heart's longing, how they are when they're happy, contented, loved. And you might imagine letting them know what you love, noticing how that touches them. Then it was as if I suddenly saw the secret beauty of their hearts. This is Thomas Merton. The depth of their hearts where neither sin nor knowledge could reach. The core of reality, the person that each one is in the eyes of the divine. If only they could see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time, there would be no more need for war, for hatred, for greed, for cruelty. I suppose the big problem would be that we would fall down and worship each other. Thank you, friends. May we all be mirrors of goodness.